Welcome back to Men and the City. In today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the dating marketplace. So I have, over the last several months since I started this channel in June, talked largely about neo-masculinity or a revolt against a legacy structure in economic terms, or I've talked about it in socio-political terms. I haven't really discussed as much about the dating market. So in today's video, I want to delve into this subject using an article that came from, I think it's called the Free Press. I'll link to it below, but it's called The Dating Pool Dropouts. What I want you to do as I go through this is think about this subject in terms of evolution versus revolution, okay? So we'll develop that theme in just a moment, but consider that prism as I go through this, and frankly, as we discuss the dating marketplace more generally. So the premise of this article is essentially the following. An increasing number of young men are dropping out of the dating pool. Now, what precisely does that mean? Well, for most of you watching, especially the young men, you know exactly what that means. What that means is that young men, have hit a point of exhaustion. They are discontented in a saturated fashion, right? They are thoroughly disenchanted and therefore disinclined to participate in a dating marketplace that they regard as toxic. They don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. And this is particularly pronounced in online dating. So online dating really got started about 20 years ago, and it was originally sold as the panacea for lonely folks, both men and women. It was a mechanism by which you could meet somebody online and cut through all of the garbage and the detritus and simply pair bond with somebody of the opposite gender. Of course, we now know that that's not at all what it has turned out to be. And in many cases, online dating has created far more barriers to entry, primarily for men, but not just for men, for both men and women. And so in a sense, it has torn the genders even farther apart than they were some 20 years ago. And when we look back today, we look back with nostalgia in part because things in the dating marketplace are even worse today than they were then. But what's happened in that time period is that men have been subjected to a more metricized approach to dating than ever before. You know, it used to be that in your local cafe or maybe the restaurant up the street or the local bar, you would go and essentially you would survey the local field of candidates and you would approach a female, or maybe you were introduced to a woman through your church or through your family or something like that. And that would ultimately facilitate some kind of a courtship period that would terminate in marriage. Now, even saying that, even repeating that process sounds incredibly old-fashioned now, but that's more or less how social dynamics between the genders worked for generations of Americans, and of course for folks beyond the borders of the United States. And today, in large parts of the world, in Asia, as an example, it is customary for the family to play a big role in facilitating the courtship process between men and women. Of course, in the United States, that's completely gone. Maybe it exists to some degree, but for the most part, that's just not the case. And we know that the county fair or the local bar is simply not how people meet anymore. They meet through online dating. And what that has created is a tremendous imbalance. It has metricized dating such that it's largely dependent on how your photo looks or how you look on camera, how tall you are, at least how tall you say you are, how much money you make, and other maybe more materialistic aspects of your personality. And it's not necessarily the case that women are superficially beholden to these characteristics, although many are. as much as it is that the algorithm empowers them to filter out men according to those principles. And so a lot of men, the majority of men, maybe 80% or higher, are frozen out of the dating marketplace. And what's even worse is that there is almost a weaponization of these metrics because of feminism, meaning that a lot of women are, what's the right word, hostile to men that don't meet this minimum threshold, whether it's height or it's income or it's a particular personality type. You know, don't be boring, for example. And of course, it's compounded by this permutation in social economics, right? Women are attending college more so today than they ever have before. They have higher incomes today than they ever have before. And so their perception of social worth or where they might stand on the social hierarchy is necessarily higher than at any time in history, certainly in American history. Well, what this has done, inadvertently or otherwise, is it has forced a lot of men out of the dating marketplace. So what becomes of those men? Well, a lot of these men are crucially important to society, right? They're plumbers or they're electricians or they're firemen. They are men that have a very successful life by most measures. But because they don't approach that upper echelon, they're completely excluded from even competing in the marketplace. Even men that conceivably qualify at the outset, men that meet the right income standards, as an example. So these are men that drive nice cars and make a lot of money, that ostensibly meet the criteria. Even a lot of high-income men struggle in the sexual marketplace today. They may not have the right personality type. They may not be very outgoing or extroverted. They may not have a lot of confidence in a given social environment. And so you have this bizarre set of circumstances that has almost frozen a lot of men out of a sexual marketplace that means most women are frozen out too, right? So just logically speaking, yes, certainly there is a decent number of women that could all congregate or flock to the same group of men. But in principle, that's not happening. And we know that that's not happening because there are growing numbers of females that are freezing their eggs, right? That are reliant upon sperm donors to actually fertilize their eggs and have children and reproduce. So the question, or the way I asked you to think about it at the beginning, was evolution versus revolution. Is this a form of evolution? In other words, women's standards are becoming very specifically tied to these metrics that do correlate, I suppose you could say, with higher genetic material, right? Men that are taller, men that make more income, men that are of a certain character type, and so forth. And so some have argued, a lot of women have argued, that their standards are higher, and therefore the men that they're pursuing or the men that they're reproducing with are better, and therefore the offspring are better, and so forth and so on. And eventually you get to this evolutionary state where everybody that survives, everybody whose genetic material is passed on, is the best or is better. That's one way to look at it. Or is this a revolutionary kind of development? And that's really what I think is going on. And that is to say that these men who are increasingly squeezed out, it's not necessarily that their genetic material isn't as good, right? Because we know that even if you're taller or you make more income, those do not necessarily mean that you're smarter or better. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't, especially in an environment like today, where getting to the top doesn't necessarily have to do with being excellent at anything. Now, does it? A lot of success today depends upon your ability to acquiesce, to conform, to practice groupthink, to be passive-aggressive, right? To be pliable. Well, those aren't traits, in my judgment, that have anything to do with being the best or being better or being stronger. In fact, you might say quite the opposite, depending on the circumstances you're in. Those are traits that you don't want at all, right? You don't want somebody that's just going to fold like a lawn chair. You don't want somebody that's going to break like glass at the first sign of trouble. You don't want somebody that's simply going to lie because everybody else lies. Now, do you? So what's more the case is revolution, and that is you have a growing, festering percentage or constituency of men, critical men, men that make the system go. You know, I've referred to them as the deltas. These are the men that take action. They're the plumbers, the electricians, the engineers, so forth and so on. They have become the undesirables in many respects because of this asymmetry in the sexual marketplace. They have no real sexual power, even though they are critically important to the functioning of society. And so what's beginning to happen is that men aren't simply dropping out of the sexual marketplace or the dating pool, as this article calls it. They're dropping out of everything. They're dropping out of colleges and universities. They are dropping out of the labor market, as I discussed in a recent video. They are divesting from society because there isn't much in it for them, right? If you can't get access to the sexual marketplace, if you can't meet the right girl and have a family and then pass what you've learned or your name or your genetic material on to somebody else, what is left for you? Not a whole lot, right? So this is actually trending in the direction of serious unrest or social dysfunction. That's what's really going on. It's not evolution, it's revolution. And what we're seeing in the sexual marketplace is the gendered version of it. It's men that have had enough. They've hit the saturation point. And so by virtue of divesting, all of the existing underlying problems that we have, whether they're economic or they're political, are accelerating. And they're going to continue to accelerate and intensify because the men that could fix them are no longer bothered to do so. They don't have skin in the game because they're not permitted to have skin in the game. And of course, even having this discussion, which is controversial, is something that you and I understand quite well. We're most likely living it ourselves. But the power structure, the gerontocracy, as I call them, the beta tyrants, the mainstream, they're completely clueless about this. They're befuddled, or they are completely benighted regarding what is really going on. They think it's evolution, not revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, the sexual marketplace, this disequilibrium, this propensity of men anymore to drop out of the sexual marketplace is mirrored in all kinds of ways across society. It's paralleled in all kinds of ways across society. And as a result, you're starting to see social breakdown. And you're going to see an intensification of that in the months and years ahead. And that will create a kind of revolutionary environment in the developed world in particular. So, stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.